Introducing rats is stressful for everyone involved. I've introduced rats on 2 separate occasions. Today I'm going to explain the rules of introductions and take you through how I introduced my rats. There are many reasons why you may need to introduce rats to each other. As a general rule, though there are some exceptions, rats shouldn't live alone, so you may end up with a lone rat who needs some friends. There are a lot of factors that you need to take into consideration before you decide to introduce rats. The first is age. Younger rats tend to be easier to introduce than older rats. This is especially true in male rats. It's easier to introduce young rats to other young rats, or young rats to adult rats, and it's more difficult to introduce teenage rats to adult rats, or adult rats to other adult rats. Older rats may be less interested in the politics of introductions, but older rats come with other risks too. Older rats may be sick, and therefore more easily stressed by the process of introductions. Another consideration is sex. Male and female rats react differently to introductions. I've only ever introduced males, so this video will focus on males. Males tend to be more predictable because there's a dominance hierarchy at work. A rat's history is also important to consider. A rat that's never lived with other rats or has spent a long time alone will likely find introductions more difficult than a rat that has been well socialized. A rat that's aggressive will need to take introductions slowly. It is also important to know if a rat is aggressive so that you don't put them in a confined space with other rats straight away. The health of all the rats involved is also worth considering. If a rat is sick, it's probably best not to put them through the stress of introductions. Existing group size and dynamics is also a factor. If you introduce a new rat into an existing group, the dynamics will change. This will result in a dominance struggle. Finally, it's important to consider every rat individually. Every introduction will be different because every rat is different. So, to sum up, it's important to consider age, sex, health, history, and existing group dynamics. But, most importantly, you need to consider all the rats as individuals. There are 4 main methods of introductions. These are the carrier method, the neutral space method, the heavy supervision method, and the cage swap method. The carrier method is where rats are put into a small space, like a cat carrier, right at the start of introductions. The space is increased if the rats get on, and once the rats have been introduced together, as long as they don't draw blood, they remain together. The neutral space method is where rats are introduced on neutral territory. This is to avoid territorial fights. The rats are introduced several times in this way before being put in a cage together. The heavy supervision method is very similar to the neutral space method, but the owner intervenes in any scuffles or fights. The cage swap method is where the rats are swapped into each other's cages so that they can get used to each other's smells. After this, introductions would move on to one of the other methods. I like to think of these 4 methods not so much as individual methods, but as tools that can be used depending on the circumstances. Okay, so now that I've gone over some of the most common methods, there are some rules of introductions. Rule number 1, quarantine. Before you even get to the stage of introductions, you need to quarantine all rats involved. This is to make sure that you're not introducing sick rats to healthy rats. Rule number 2, take it slow. Don't rush introductions. It's better to move too slowly than too quickly. Rule number 3, work in stages. Break the introduction process into easy to manage stages. That way, it's easy to move back a step if you need to. Rule number 4, no blood, no foul. During introductions, there will be scuffles. It's usually best not to break every scuffle up. These scuffles can be rough, but generally speaking, if the rats aren't drawing blood, they're probably okay. This rule is up to the owner's discretion. Rule number 5, look out for yourself. Be careful. Don't put your hand between two rats fighting for dominance. And if you need to break rats up, use a glove so they don't bite you. And rule number 6, you're not in control. The first introduction story that I'm going to share with you illustrates this pretty well. Hercules was a 9-week-old rat that I got from a rescue centre. He'd been taken out of a situation where he'd been housed with female rats, so he'd had to be separated. Hercules was such a sweet boy. He was so friendly and always wanted to speak to people. I had gotten 2 slightly younger boys, Miles and Sebastian, to introduce to him. I broke almost every rule of introductions with Hercules. I didn't even quarantine them. I really don't recommend this. All 3 of mine ended up with mites. I didn't even take it slow. I tried to, initially introducing them on neutral territory, but Hercules very quickly took control of the situation. He'd flip the younger rats over so they were lying belly up. He never actually hurt them though, and they just let him do it. When I put Hercules back in his temporary cage, he'd just sleep. It was obvious that he was desperate to be with Miles and Sebastian. During one introduction, I'd taken Hercules out first, and when I opened the cage to get Miles and Sebastian out, Hercules jumped in. He proceeded to explore the cage, whilst Miles and Sebastian followed him. I ended up letting him stay in the cage because they were all getting along. I was definitely not in control for this introduction, and this introduction could definitely have been done better, but somehow it worked. This is why I think it's important to consider each rat individually, because this worked for Hercules, but this probably wouldn't work for every rat. The second introduction story that I'm going to share with you is how I introduced Darwin to Scout and Bailey. You might have heard some of this story already if you've watched some of my other videos. I have a double critter nation, which you can see behind me. It has 2 levels which can be separated. I had Scout and Bailey on the bottom and Darwin on the top. This was so that they were close to each other, but not so close that they could reach each other. After a day of living like that, I swapped out each other's bedding. So Darwin got Scout and Bailey's bedding, and Scout and Bailey got Darwin's bedding. This was to help them get used to each other's smells. After another day, I swapped their cages. So Darwin was on the bottom, and Scout and Bailey were on the top. I did this without cleaning the cage out in between, so that they would get used to living in the presence of each other's smells. None of them showed any signs of aggression during these steps. The signs of aggression that I was looking for were where a rat puffs up to make themselves look bigger, or any huffing or hissing noises coming from any of the rats. I next introduced them on neutral territory. If you've seen some of my previous videos, then you probably already know that these introductions didn't go as well as I'd hoped. Darwin never showed any signs of aggression towards Scout and Bailey, but he didn't really acknowledge them either. This is where knowing a rat's history can be useful. I don't know what Darwin's history was because he's a rescue rat, but it's likely that he had never been socialised with other rats before. There were no signs of aggression though, so I moved on to the next step, where I put Darwin, Scout and Bailey all in the same cage together. I'm happy to say it worked, and they all get along fine now. This is how I've done introductions in the past, but I'd love to hear from you. Have you done introductions? What did you do? And do you have any other rules that I haven't included? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Bye!